And welcome back here to Live Now from Fox. I'm Andrew Kraft. Well, we do have our vantage point there over the Jerusalem skyline back. Earlier today and over the weekend, we heard from the White House announcing that there was an agreement on extending the ceasefire between Lebanon, Hezbollah, and Israel. It will now continue to be in effect until February the 18th of this year. Well, Fox News correspondent Mike Tobin has a look at the ceasefire extension and updates on the Israel-Hamas war. Let's watch.
The long march home, almost 16 months since a brutal war drove them out. With meager belongings on their backs or makeshift carts, they returned to find a wasteland. A mediator of the ceasefire that brought them home said they could have returned months ago when the ceasefire was constructed, but Israel and Hamas could not agree.
We felt the sense of responsibility that this day is costing a lot of lives, whether it's on the Gazas or the hostages that have been held in Gaza.
Stunning the region, President Trump floated the idea of moving Palestinians to neighboring countries while Gaza is rebuilt.
I'd like Egypt to take people, and I'd like Jordan to take people. I mean, you're talking about probably 1.5 million people, and we just clean out that whole thing.
The idea was universally rejected by Arabs, especially Palestinians, who fear they would be locked out of Gaza.
Palestinians will never accept to be displaced into other places.
The ceasefire was salvaged when Hamas scheduled the release of a female civilian hostage, Arbel Yahoud. She's supposed to be freed Thursday, along with Agam Berger, the last female soldier held in Gaza, and a third unidentified hostage. An additional 3 hostages will be released Saturday. 7 hostages have been liberated in this first phase of the ceasefire. Parents, now reunited with their daughters, credit the U.S.
Thank you, President Trump, for everything you are doing for our hostages.
The deputy chief of the IDF Medical Corps says all of the hostages released thus far had injuries from October the 7th. The medical care they received in captivity was not up to Western standards. They were malnourished, but otherwise, physically, they were okay. Going forward, he anticipates the hostages will be in worse shape because the ones still being held are older. In Tel Aviv, Mike Tobin, Fox News.
Mike, thanks so much. So remember, there are kind of 2 dueling ceasefires in place right now, one between Israel, Lebanon, and Hezbollah, and the other between Israel and Hamas, brokered by Egypt, Qatar, the United States, and others here. So I wanted to make that distinction there. Mike Tobin with great reporting. In the meantime, let's bring into the conversation our friend and colleague, national security analyst and expert, and retired Marine intelligence officer, Hal Kempfer. He joins me. Hal, good to see you, and I hope you had a good weekend here. And still, the scenes that we saw out of the Middle East over the weekend of these 4 female hostages who were released were really quite breathtaking here. And more will be released throughout the course of the evening, or excuse me, the course of the week, rather. But in the meantime, Hal, I wanted to ask you this, because we have our live picture there in Jerusalem. You and I have talked so much about the day after the war is over and what happens with Gaza, what happens with the Palestinians, who will administer Gaza, and the like here. Well, President Trump kind of took that part of the conversation to a whole new level over the last few days. And he was flying back from Miami to Washington, and he caught up with reporters on Air Force One today. And Hal, he said this. He told reporters on his plane tonight he spoke with Egyptian President Al-Sisi about transferring Palestinians from the Gaza Strip to Egypt. He said, "I want them to live in a place without violence. Gaza has been hell for so many years. They can live in much better and more comfortable areas," he said. He then said again that Al-Sisi is his friend. He said, "I've helped him a lot, and I hope he'll help us. I think he'll do it. And the King of Jordan will do it too," Trump said. Now, according to Barak Ravid at Axios, Egypt and Jordan made it clear in official statements Sunday that they oppose initiatives to transfer Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. The Palestinian Authority also rejected the idea outright and condemned it. But as we know, with some of these ideas that come from Donald Trump's lips, they do gain purchase once they leave his lips. Hal, do you think that will be the same with this idea? Because you and I have talked throughout the course of this war, Egypt and Jordan, from the very outset, and even before October 7th, would not and do not want to take Palestinians into their countries, into their territories. Now that Trump is saying this, could that flip the switch, flip the calculus. Are you confident or no? Will Egypt and Jordan succeed in rebuffing this effort yet again, no matter if Trump is saying it?
Well, Andrew, I think you put a good perspective on that, which is when President Trump says it, it does tend to gain purchase, certainly over time, and it becomes a discussion point. You know, going back, if I could just put this in perspective, historically, that has always been sacrosanct. You shall not discuss displacing Palestinians outside the Gaza Strip, and that's because it goes back to the founding of Israel, when so many Palestinians left their homes, or they would say were forced to leave their homes by the Israelis, and so many of them fled into the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, never to return. And that is a huge cultural issue within the Palestinian community, within Arab countries around Israel, and so that is a huge hurdle to overcome. Also, the second thing is a lot of the Palestinians that left Israel in its founding, and then after the '67 war, and went to Jordan. And so Jordan has an extremely large ethnic Palestinian population, which makes the Hashemite kingdom a little unstable at times, politically speaking. In fact, they even had to put down a rebellion by the Palestinians back in 1970. And this is the king's father that had to do this. And then the other part is Hamas. Hamas comes from the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is from Egypt. They were originally based in Cairo, and you may recall that wasn't that many years ago that the Muslim Brotherhood actually gained power in Egypt, and that the current regime, if you will, and basically had a military coup to force them out of power. So they don't want anyone who has an ideological tie or any other ties to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. So there's a lot of reasons why this won't happen. Of course, the other side is this: most of the Gaza Strip is physically destroyed. It's uninhabitable. It's not just the buildings; it's also everything else: water, sewage, power. So there is a rebuilding thing, and he brings up a good point, which is, where do you put everybody while you're doing the rebuilding?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to psychoanalyze Trump. Obviously, he came from the world of New York City real estate, and that is what I imagine he is thinking, that there isn't much left of the Gaza Strip, at least structurally, from an infrastructure standpoint, for Palestinians to go back to. I mean, do you think that is where he is coming from here? But from what he is saying, he is essentially saying that, you know, the Gaza Strip right now, in its form as it currently exists, does not exist.
You know, it's interesting. If you look at physical infrastructure, the Gaza Strip in its current form really doesn't exist, certainly compared to where it was before.
So does Trump have a point, Al, is what I'm asking. I guess, does Trump have a point in making that argument?
I think he does. I think he's got a point, except for the incredible, you know, it's one thing to look at it from a physical infrastructure standpoint in terms of buildings and all the other stuff associated with maintaining urban infrastructure. But then you deal with the political template, if you will, overlaying that, and the social template overlaying that, which is forcing the Palestinians into what they would consider yet another diaspora. And of course, if you want to get into the founding of Israel, that was actually from a diaspora that was forced by the Romans, where Jews that lived, Israelites, if you will, that lived there, were forced to flee Roman persecution around the world. So there are a lot of different ways to examine this, but there is a fundamental problem. The other thing, too, I'd point out is that Hamas is dedicated, of course, to the destruction of Israel, still dedicated to the destruction of Israel. So there's no way to deal with Hamas, and that is going to be an enormous hurdle in any, the phase 2, phase 3 negotiations, which is who will rule Gaza. And it can't be Hamas, but Palestinian Authority, nothing else has really stood up. So there's a lot to work through there. And so even though this does seem like overreaching to say, hey, Palestinians move to another country or do something else, I have to tell you, with the hurdles they have to deal with to get through just to get Gaza back functioning again, I don't rule anything out. One thing I would point out, though, is that at one time, Donald Trump had made mention of Gaza. And he says, and again, to your point, as a real estate developer, he said, that is a fantastic location. Look where it's at, right on the Mediterranean with the beaches and everything. So he does have a different perspective.
Right.
And of course, if you look at what, and I, I've had the privilege of traveling to some countries that, if you go back to 70s, 60s, really weren't that impressive tourist destinations. And now they are in the Persian Gulf. I mean, Qatar, I would point out, incredible place. Of course, everybody knows about Dubai and Abu Dhabi.
Right.
But these were not great tourist destinations. Now they are. So there is something to what he's saying there. And frankly, Gaza is a lot closer to Europe and other places than the Persian Gulf. So, I mean, there is some credence to that.
All right. Hal, let's talk about the ceasefire that's in place. I guess we've seen some of these hostages be released, 7 of them so far. We're going to see more of them released throughout the course of the week here. It's been, I was doing the math, 12 days. The ceasefire agreement was announced on the 15th of January. It's now the 27th here. Are you surprised it's held that long?
I'm not completely surprised it's held that long, but I am not surprised to see some major fissures that have appeared. Of course, first off, this weekend, one of the female hostages that was supposed to be released, a civilian, was not released. And it's like, okay, here we go. Hamas is again not fulfilling its obligations under the ceasefire agreement. They substituted and sent out a female soldier, did not release the civilian, and that was one of the agreements that they had negotiated, was that the civilians will get released, the female civilians will get released before the female soldiers get released. And so that was a problem. Now, of course, the other problem is what's just come out, which is that 8 of the 33 hostages on that list are dead. That's what Israel has just put out, and they have it on very, very good authority that is the case. That's about 25% of the hostages in phase 1 are not alive. That is a big issue because that goes to Hamas not giving them a list. When they asked for, that was part of the agreement, they had to give them a list of hostages to be released. Hamas turned around and gave them a list that was the same list that Israel gave them initially, saying, we think these hostages might be alive, we're not sure. And they gave it right back to them, said, well, this is not a validated list. This is just a list that we gave you.
Okay.
Now, there is a list that I understand that Hamas has provided today. I don't know how that compares with the previous list. That wasn't quite clear, but I did hear the list did get forwarded. But these are some major things that could break down this entire ceasefire, is if Hamas keeps doing things like this. By the way, if a fourth of these hostages are this initial 33 hostages that have been so closely negotiated, if a fourth of those on that list are not alive, I shudder to think what's with the remaining hostages, what the percentage there is, because that's been a lot of speculation for some time, which is how many of those hostages are actually still alive. And of course, these are younger hostages too. I mean, the 4 females that came out, they were all captured when they were teenagers. Now we're getting into older hostages, civilians and military, and we saw how badly treated these hostages are. I'm very concerned that we could have a numbers issue here.
Yeah. Hal, we have a live picture there at the White House. I just want to pick your brain on this. We're going to move off the Middle East briefly because obviously former Senator Marco Rubio, now Secretary of State Rubio, is making his voices known at the State Department, as you do when you lead the agency, in the form of foreign aid, Hal. And so I have a statement in front of me from Tammy Bruce. She's the new department spokesperson there. She says this in the statement, that consistent with President Trump's executive order on reevaluating and realigning United States foreign aid, Secretary Rubio has paused all U.S. foreign assistance funded by or through the State Department and the U.S. Agency for International Development for review. She says he's initiating a review of all foreign assistance programs to ensure they're efficient and consistent with U.S. foreign policy under the America First agenda. So, Hal, for now, apparently all foreign aid is paused that the State Department doles out, that USAID doles out, because it is under review. So it's not gone forever. It's just on pause while this review is pending. Do I have that right?
And that's about right.
Okay.
It is in review. It's going to be, at first I heard 90 days and then I heard 60 days. I'm
Okay.
not quite sure how long this review is going to take. I would point out, though, that a lot of this, State Department aid, you think, okay, State Department aid, USAID, you think aid like, civilian aid, let's just put it that way, non-military aid would be affected. Now, two countries do have an exception on this, which is Israel and Egypt. Their aid is unimpeded with this ban, but everybody else is affected. This actually goes beyond that. There are a number of military programs where we send teams overseas to work with the host countries. We do a lot of stuff working with host countries around the world with our allies. They send officials here to get training and education and all sorts of things. Part of that is paid for with Department of State funds. Not all of it, but part of it is paid for with that.
Okay.
And that's the real question right now, is they are kind of frozen in place.
Okay.
Because they're not quite sure what they can or can't do without violating this directive. So that's being rapidly worked out right now, which is, it's not just civilian State Department aid, nation state development or whatever. There's national security, military implications of what we're doing here.
Okay.
Now, Ukraine today said their aid is unimpeded. They didn't see any change with what they're getting from the United States, and that may be the case.
Okay.
That's just what they said. But there are military implications to the State Department thing. And
well, I'll give you one, Hal.
Very important. I'm sorry.
I'll give you one of those implications, kind of the second and third order effects of this. Reuters, in an exclusive report over the weekend, has it that Trump's foreign aid pause has forced a suspension of flights for more than 40,000 Afghans approved for special U.S. visas and at risk of Taliban retribution there. So that was just one example that I found reading from the piece in Reuters. Also, the UN Secretary General's office responding to this, Hal, in a statement today, saying the Secretary General notes with concern the announcement of a pause in U.S. foreign assistance. The Secretary General calls for additional exemptions to be considered to ensure the continued delivery of critical development and humanitarian activities for the most vulnerable communities around the world, whose lives and livelihoods depend on this support. The Secretary General looks forward to engaging with the new U.S. administration on the provision of much-needed development support to people grappling with the most difficult challenges confronting the developing world. The United States is one of the largest aid providers, and it is vital that we work constructively to jointly shape a strategic path forward. That was Stefan Dujarric, the chief spokesman there for the Secretary General's office, Antonio Guterres. So this is somewhat reverberating, Hal.
Oh, it's reverberating in a major way. And it has reverberations in a lot of different directions. You look at that, and of course the exception was made for Egypt and Israel, but this has big reverberations throughout the Indo-Pacific and various countries that we have strong engagements there, dealing with trying to contain the expansionist and intrusive efforts of China in the South China Sea and elsewhere. And some of those efforts are now kind of in limbo. It's not quite clear if they're going to go forward. So I think there does need to be some real clarification on this, and there might need to be further bifurcation. It might be they need to bifurcate just like they did with Egypt and Israel. The way it was issued, it basically was a pretty big net, shall we say, was cast, and they need to make sure that is this impeding our military, national security, international security interests as well. And I'm not saying that the other things with doing aid for developing countries, dealing with a variety of things like, food, food issues, medical issues, things like that are not absolutely critically important. But I do think they need to kind of do this evaluation pretty darn quick.
Okay. Hal, we're going to have to leave it at that. We always thank you for your insight, and we'll definitely talk soon.